Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Data Chronicle podcast. I am your host, Scott Laughlin, and co-chair of the Privacy and Cybersecurity practice at Hogan Lovells. We are so excited to talk today about biometric data and the unique issues that it's creating in the automotive industry as more and more biometrics are added to cars. I'm thrilled to be joined by three of my colleagues, James Denville, Alicia Poller, and Jay Ettinger. Thank you so much for joining me. Alicia, Jay, you just wrote and published an article about how biometric issues were coming up in connection with the automotive industry, and I really would love to get all of your feedback. And James, I know this is an area that you spend a lot of your time on. So maybe, James, I can ask you to start and just set the frame for us about how biometrics is increasingly becoming an issue in consumer electronics and how different technology companies are integrating biometrics data into their products and services.
Sure thing. Happy to talk about that, Scott. So biometrics, I think the core version of biometrics that we see on a day-to-day basis, depending on the type of device that you have, you carry around with you, is going to be for secure access to a device, whether it's a fingerprint or whether it's a facial scan like Face ID, or using your thumbprint or another finger to access a device. That's one of the core uses of any biometrics for a lot of consumer electronics. And that's been probably for decades been the core use case for biometrics, is a way to provide secure access to some kind of system or some kind of room or some kind of device. We're now seeing biometrics just develop more. It's no longer just used to verify whether someone is who they say they are based on the biometric template that was recorded earlier. It could also be to recognize people when they walk into areas or visit areas that they have not maybe even been to before based on a facial recognition template that someone recognizes. That could be used for asset protection. It could be used for personalization or customization. Could be to say, oh, I now recognize this user. They like their device to be set up in a certain way. So rather than giving you access to a device, it configures the device to the way that you want it to be, whether it's volume, whether it's temperature, anything like that, that the biometrics could be used for. Or, and I mean, as most people have now seen on social media, some form of biometrics could just facilitate identifying people in pictures. So that's another way that we've seen biometrics being used in the past couple of decades. I think probably the last version that we're seeing more biometrics being used for, whether it's facial recognition or some kind of facial scanning or some kind of stance or gait or some other kind of physical measurement that's allowing devices or systems to recognize people, is the customization of content that you might see on our browsers, on our laptops, and our desktop computers. There are cookies that allow various websites to recognize us. So now maybe for digital screens that are going to pop up certain ways, instead of recognizing us by a cookie, you might have certain devices that are recognizing people by familiar biometric patterns, whether that's facial recognition or some other kind of biometric.
But James, maybe the part that I think always comes up in these laws and these issues is, well, what constitutes biometric data? And, you gave a couple of examples, right? One where a piece of software is identifying a unique voice or a unique gait or a facial recognition. And you say, all right, that's clearly biometric data. And then on the other side, you had mentioned, a cookie is not going to constitute biometric information, even though that does uniquely identify you. Where do you see that line to be established, especially as more and more electronics integrate and are customized to individuals based on how they use them?
That's a great question, Scott. I think the core thing to remember when talking about biometrics is that it's a biological metric. So what it is some form of metric where it's measuring a physical, a biological, or a behavioral characteristic of an individual and using that typically to verify or authenticate someone's identity. And typically, if you look at most of the definitions of biometrics in the law, it's going to be some kind of physical, biological, behavioral characteristics that's used to identify a person. So that's why it's different than a cookie. A cookie is going to be something associated with a device, whereas a facial scan, an iris scan, a thumbprint, gait, typing speed, or some kind of characteristic where it's about a person and how they look, how they behave, or some other biological, physical characteristic of them, that's going to what cause something to be a biometric.
So biological, physical, as it relates to behavior, biometrics, but behavior alone, like the types of websites I go to and whether I'm more likely to click on this ad versus that ad, even though it's behavioral, not biometrics.
Correct. Yep.
Got it. Okay. So now, Alicia, love to hear your perspective on this. I think one of the areas that you commented on in your article was how cars and automobiles were increasingly using biometric powered technology in connection with their operation. Maybe you can, describe a little bit about what you're seeing in the space.
Absolutely. And when I started to drive and learn to drive on a stick shift with crank windows, I never could have predicted the types of autonomous vehicles and biometric information that we're now seeing used in vehicles. So it's really a fun space, and we're seeing really two main buckets of uses for biometrics in cars. So the first is for security. James mentioned this a few minutes ago. We're seeing facial recognition software or fingerprints used to unlock or lock your vehicle. The second bucket is for safety. So we're seeing pulse and eye tracking technology. This monitors a driver's eyelid fatigue. So if you're starting to get drowsy behind the wheel, the sensors will pick that up. So we're talking about lots of sensors and cameras inside your vehicle. There's also biometric seat technology. So this is usually a seat belt, sometimes in combination with steering wheel technology. And that will monitor your heart rate, your blood pressure, your pulse, and even your body temperature. This way, the sensors could, for example, alert emergency responders if the driver has a medical emergency and can no longer drive the vehicle safely.
Wow, you're right. I mean, I think we've come a long way since the stick shift cars. Are these technologies that are currently in production, or these are things that are kind of being anticipated for future cars?
It's both. Some of these already appear in cars that are out in the world. I think it'll become a lot more common. So it's not just something you'll see in a fleet of trucks. You'll see this in the cars that we all drive, that we teach our kids to drive if they're not driving us across the board by then.
And so then I was trying to track all of the different types of biometric information that you were just mentioning. I heard irises, I heard eye fatigue, I heard heart rate. Maybe you can just spend a couple more minutes just talking a little bit about the specific types of data that your automobile may start to collect about you to provide these functions.
So taking a step back to think about what that data looks like. So one is the facial scan. So some of this might be scans your face, sees it's you, unlocks your vehicle, or you're ready to lock up. You don't need to hold on to a key anymore, scans your face, locks up your car for you. I hope what it does, although I haven't seen this yet, is that it'll move all your mirrors and your seats into the right position. No more futzing around to get into the right spot. They're going to take my face into account. But we also see fingerprints. So I think James mentioned, some of us use our fingerprints to unlock a phone or a tablet. We might see that, and I think already are seeing that in certain cars on the market. And then the rest of all of what I consider to be in that safety bucket. So it's blood pressure, heart rate. Your iris scan is almost like when we think about a facial scan, but just of your eyes. And so some of that is to identify who is the person, but some of it is to track, are you looking in the right direction? Are your eyes on the road? Are you distracted by looking behind you at noisy kids in the back seat? Are you getting tired and falling asleep when you're a trucker who's driving across the country and you should really pull over and take a rest stop? So lots of different technologies being used to interact with those safety features. Part of the question here is how much of that is being collected and used in the instant versus stored for longer term use. So what I mean by that is if you're using a fingerprint in order to access and lock up your car, it actually needs to be stored in some way to recognize you the next time. Whereas some of this biometric information could be used in the moment, but not actually stored in a way that would be prone to a data breach in the future. It would be instantaneous. Are your eyes looking in the right direction? And then once you're out of the car, it's not really stored long term. It could be deleted rather quickly.
Yeah, I mean, that distinction I think is really important. And maybe, James, I can go back to you quickly to talk a little bit about, how the law in this area has been shaping, including, I think what Alicia was describing was a number of examples where measurements were being taken, information was being gathered relating to your physical appearance, whether your eyes are sagging because you're tired or, whether you are no longer concentrating on the road. but it's that information is being collected not for the purposes of trying to uniquely identify somebody, but instead to identify whether the car should take particular actions, including, having that person rest. So as you maybe kind of first start and tell us a little bit about how the law looks here, and including whether the data that we should care about is really the data that only relates to identifying somebody, or whether it's broader than that.
Yeah. So traditionally, the privacy and security issues raised by biometrics are really focused on the fact that biometrics are a fairly precious identifier. One of the reasons that fingerprints are so great at authenticating you, is verifying you as an individual, is no one else has fingerprints just like you. No one else has an iris scan or a facial scan just like you. Even twins, apparently, there's enough differences that a sophisticated enough biometric measurement is going to be able to tell the difference. So one of the reasons that we wanted to protect them was, well, this is one thing that you have that, unlike a password, some people may have the same passwords or reuse them, but we want to make sure that these very unique identifiers are not compromised in a way so that somebody can actually steal it and then really be able to spoof you if they somehow get their hands on the biometric template. So that's, for the most part, been the definition, and the reason that we focused on biometrics is we focus on information, behavioral, biological, or some other kind of characteristic that's a biological characteristic that is used to identify a person. One of the challenges that has popped up with biometric laws is that in Illinois, the Biometric Information Privacy Act, or BIPA, and this is the only state that really has this particular definition, has split up biometrics into two different sorts. There's biometric identifiers and biometric information. And biometric identifiers, as defined under BIPA, they are not limited to information that can be or even is used to identify you. A scan of facial geometry is a biometric identifier, period, even if nobody's using it to identify you, or even if it couldn't be used to identify you. That's just the way that it is defined in the law. So if we're scanning someone's face to see whether they're looking over to the right way too much, or they're looking at some device as opposed to keeping their eyes on the road, or it looks like their eyes are closing because they're getting drowsy, that could still be viewed under BIPA as a biometric identifier, even though it's not being used to identify you as a person.
Interesting. And so Illinois, you mentioned, has that expansive notion of what biometric data is. And presumably, I think there are a few other states that also govern biometric data in particular. What does the overall landscape, at least in the United States, look like for laws relating specifically to biometric data?
So we don't have too many state laws at the moment that are specifically regulating biometrics. I mean, we've got Washington, we've got Illinois, and we've got Texas. And they, for the most part, Washington and Texas, are focused on information that could be used to identify a person. Texas's law could be a little bit broader, maybe looking at voice prints, facial scans, and it's without expressly stating that it doesn't matter whether it's used to identify an individual. So it could be somewhat broad, but for the most part, except for Illinois, we've got laws that really identify it based on whether it is being used or could be used to identify an individual. Then we've got the comprehensive privacy laws that are coming out, starting with California, and then Virginia and Utah and Connecticut and Colorado and more states coming. Their definitions of biometrics tend to focus on information that is being used to uniquely identify an individual. So again, it's focusing on the more traditional concerns about biometrics. If it's a piece of information, the reason it's sensitive because it could be used or is being used to uniquely identify you as a person.
Got it. Jay, next question is for you. The article that you authored does spend most of the time focused on BIPA in particular as being kind of the primary source of risk to automobile companies as they're integrating the technologies that Alicia was talking about. Why is that? Why are we focused on Illinois in particular?
Thank you for the question, Scott. We found that BIPA has become a major focal point for the plaintiff's bar. First and foremost, because it's the only biometric state law that provides a private right of action. As James mentioned, both Washington State and Texas have biometric-specific laws, but those can only be enforced by the state attorney general. And there's a couple of reasons why it presents an appealing option for plaintiffs. First, in a challenge that a lot of plaintiffs face when it comes to privacy-related litigation is being able to show the damages caused by the intrusion into their privacy. Whereas BIPA provides for statutory damages in either the amount of $1,000 or $5,000 per violation. So that quickly can add up to be very significant amounts of damages that are at issue. And in recent cases, we've seen Illinois state courts expand that potential risk of harm, including a recent decision just this last year in Cawthron v. White Castle, in which the court found that each time or each instance in which a biometric is scanned or taken is a separate violation. So, for instance, in cases in the past involving fingerprints at workplaces, rather than one instance of a violation for when you obtain that fingerprint, it's each time that employee scans in at work counts as a separate statutory violation. And this has really resulted in quite significant findings of both jury damages and settlements. We've seen some on the magnitude of tens of to hundreds of millions of dollars. And so it's something that the plaintiff's bar is definitely focused on and is a key area and will likely continue to be so moving forward as more states continue to consider these types of laws as well.
And it's really helpful, Jay. And maybe, James, I can ask you, as you were describing the requirements of BIPA earlier, kind of what the scope of that law is. That law presumably doesn't make collection of biometric data unlawful. There presumably is things that we can do to make that, to adequately protect the data as we're collecting it, or to make sure that we are doing that appropriately. What are the traps that need to be run in Illinois when you collect this information? How can you comply with BIPA?
Sure. So the requirements in some ways are fairly straightforward, particularly if you're talking about a traditional use case of biometrics, where maybe in an employment context, I am collecting a fingerprint to authenticate somebody entering into a certain room that has the crown jewels into it. So what I would need is I need to inform you that I'm going to collect your biometrics with a writing. So it's got to be a written notice that tells you I am going to collect your biometrics. This is what I'm going to use it for. This is who I'm going to share it with, including service providers, because again, the idea is this information is fairly sensitive, fairly special. So I want to make sure that you understand who I'm going to share it with, what I'm going to use it for, how long I'm going to keep it. So there needs to be some retention information or a reference to a publicly available retention policy that says how I'm going to destroy it when either I no longer need it or when it's been 3 years since my last interaction with you. So I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to tell you how I'm going to delete it and how long I'm going to retain it. And then I need your signature. So what I need is a written signature saying, I consent to you processing it in the way you've described it. And I have to tell you what I'm going to collect, what I'm going to use it for, who I'm sharing it with, and how I'm going to retain it again. That is, I mean, it's a little bit cumbersome. You've got to come up with this notice. Maybe you've got to publish this retention policy, get the person's signature. But again, if we're just talking about fingerprints to access a room, that's fairly straightforward. If you're talking about maybe accessing a device, depending on the nature and the ways in which the biometrics are being implemented on a device, again, maybe you've got a pop-up screen that tells you, this is what I'm going to collect and so forth and so on. Or if you're accessing some web app and it's going to be using facial recognition by using the camera on your device, again, you may be able to deal with that fairly readily and easily. I think where it becomes challenging in the automotive context is particularly if I now need to obtain your written consent with fairly informed written consent, along with some notices about drowsy driving tools that I have in the vehicle, that is going to become challenging, because where in the vehicle am I going to be able to display the notice? How am I going to be able to obtain your signature, particularly when most vehicles are used by multiple people, including by guests?
It's fascinating, James, and maybe Alicia, I can ask you from your perspective on how automotive companies can try to manage to those consent requirements, because it sounds like this is not as simple as just adding another sheet of paper. I mean, many times you already sign something when you're trying to buy a car. Now we're talking about trying to come up with alternative ways or additional ways to try to collect consent while inside of the vehicle.
That's a great question, and I don't have a great answer yet. I think it'll be really fascinating to see what courts do with this question, because the way that you obtain effective consent in all of the various ways that James just mentioned outside of the vehicle kind of gotten familiar with what that looks like and you see something pop up and maybe you scroll through all the way to the end, maybe you don't, and then you click, you agree to the terms and you move on. You use the app or you use a certain device. And so here, maybe that is feasible when you're thinking about the initial person who buys that car. But for anyone else, different passengers, someone who's borrowing the car, someone who drives it temporarily, maybe you loan it to a sibling or someone who helps watch your kids temporarily, how are they going to sign this? And then more importantly, what about any passenger who's in the car where the sensors and cameras are picking up on their biometric information? They might not even understand, if something pops up on the screen in the middle of your console before you get driving and the driver is forced to click that before the car is proceeding. There's really not a good mechanism in place yet for what that looks like for any of the other passengers in the vehicle. And then one other wrinkle is, what about when your passengers are minors? So you're thinking about informed written consent and collection and use of biometric information that can be collected from children. And we don't really have any creative ideas yet in this space. There's been a lot of brainstorming about what consent might look like, but no one has really come up with something that would abide by all of the requirements that James just gave us from BIPA or similar laws that are out there, kind of in the early days of thinking through what that looks like, that would also provide the consent that is needed.
But let's pause there, because if I am an automobile manufacturer and I sell a car to an individual, my relationship is really with that individual. And if that individual decides to lend the car to another person, to their babysitter, or to a spouse or to a loved one, how is it that my relationship as the manufacturer extends outward to that other party who I have no relationship? They didn't buy a car from me. They have not signed up for any of the subscription services that I offer. Why does that duty or responsibility then extend outward to those other guests?
Sure. Well, it may and it may not. So if you are limiting your collection and use of biometric information to the driver, you might be okay, particularly if there is some other mechanism by which a driver who borrows the car can consent via console or some other notice that pops up. But I think the trick is, your question assumes that there needs to be a direct relationship that relies on the exchange of money. Maybe you've purchased the vehicle. But if that manufacturer or others that are providing technology in the car that collect and use and disclose biometric information are picking that up from other passengers, it doesn't really matter if those passengers didn't initiate the relationship. And in some ways, it actually leads to greater liability if they didn't, because they might be more surprised, more outraged by the fact that this biometric information is being collected or used or disclosed. And those are really the folks that are more likely to say, well, wait a minute, I don't care if the driver wanted this to be collected. I didn't want this to be collected when I rode in your car or I borrowed it for a week.
I would say, Scott, jumping on that, we've seen that risk pop up, particularly in social media or in online photo albums, where you can see that one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest sources of risk has been the non-users, the fact that other people have uploaded photos into certain platforms, and then those platforms have run facial recognition to identify people. And one of the hardest things is, well, now you have a bunch of people who have no relationship with you, who never consented, and that's been one of the sources of class action risk. And I do think, though, one wrinkle here for the automotive industry that is potentially helpful, and there has been some support for this, is if you're just processing tricks on device, and you are not on the vehicle, and you are not directly collecting it or possessing it. And if you can support the arguments to say that, okay, all of this is happening on the vehicle, we don't possess it, we don't access it, we never collect it. There is now some room based on some case law that could support this. Again, it's not definitive yet, that if it is a voluntary activation of these services, so that's one factor you need to have, and this can't be just things that are always on and on by default, but if the user activates it on their own, they can turn it off if they want, and they control it, that then it's on the owner. So it could be the vehicle owner that is potentially responsible, if anyone at all, and not the OEM or the distributor of the vehicle, because they are never collecting or possessing that biometric. It's all happening on the vehicle.
So in other words, if you have a car that is, instead of using a key to start it, you use your face, And the car has a kind of a record of what my face looks like. And then each time I come in, it compares my current face versus my old face. And if that matches some level of consistency, then it will start. But the difference that you're describing, James, is that my original face never leaves the car. It was always on the car, and the car was owned by me. Thus, it was never really being processed or collected by the OEM or by the manufacturer.
Yeah, that is a potential way to avoid some of the consent notice requirements, and that's been supported in certain areas with authentication to mobile devices. One of the challenges or the downsides of that is it may be very useful across a fleet of cars, maybe across rental cars or car share services, or maybe within a brand of car, if you're going to have a family of cars, is that I want my image to actually be shared across. So whenever I get into a certain brand of car or in a certain car share service, that it will recognize me as me. And then they're going to need that consent, because then it theoretically is going to have to be transmitted outside of the vehicle in order to facilitate that cross vehicle service.
So beyond that, it sounds like, are we headed to a future where whenever I get into the car, there's going to be a long list of terms and conditions that I have to hit collect, like agree. And then only after that, the car will actually start?
I think there's the potential for that until we get to a point where there is arguably comprehensive federal privacy law that is going to preempt all of the specific state requirements, including biometric privacy laws and maybe other, whether it's geolocation data or the other types of data that are particularly going to be collected by vehicles, safety data, driving behavior information, geolocation, biometrics. Until we have a uniform way of addressing that, one of the challenges is we have antiquated laws in some ways that were meant to address the typical fingerprint collection for security purposes. And now we have biometric equipped vehicles. That was not contemplated at the time that BIPA was drafted or that other privacy laws were drafted. So I think that there may be a danger that we will have to move that way. Potentially that can be supported through heads up displays. The more that we have essentially tablets that are at the center of a vehicle, there's perhaps more real estate where you can provide those notices and obtain the consents. But we may be leading towards, just like for a mobile device where you need to obtain consents and permissions to access certain things, we may need that for vehicles as well.
So, Jay, Alicia and James have both kind of made the case that this is really an important issue, in particular in Illinois. Where are the trend lines moving? Are we seeing more proposals, more potential legislative action look like Texas and Washington? Or are we seeing them more look like BIPA and Illinois for the future?
Yeah, I think it's a bit early to tell. There's definitely an increased public awareness of the collection of biometric data and increased interest among legislatures. I think within the last year, there were 15 different states that were considering their own form of a biometric data law. And so in the interim, we've actually started to see some cities take action. So for instance, New York City has created its own biometric scanning law that prohibits commercial establishments from collecting biometric information. It's a little different. They can have public notice, like on a storefront, for instance, rather than having to obtain written consent, such as in BIPA. But similarly, it does provide for a private right of action with up to $1,000 per instance in statutory damages. Similarly, in Portland, Oregon as well, there's prohibitions on the use of facial recognition technology in private establishments. And so you're starting to see, both at the local and state level, a strong interest among legislatures in trying to find solutions to better protect their constituents' privacy interests when it comes to biometric information. And we'll be having to see kind of what form that falls closer to the Washington and Texas model or something more closely aligned with the BIPA model.
So are we heading toward the direction that kind of looks like the current privacy landscape in the United States, where we have a general privacy laws that apply in different contexts, including, James, you mentioned that includes biometric data at times. And then we have certainly healthcare specific laws that, depending on the context, may pick up biometric data too. And now we have this kind of third tier of laws, not to say that they're less important, but they're just unique and different, that are specific to those types, and they may differ depending on where you are in the country and the types of processing that you're doing.
I think that's right. I think we will end up, the way things are headed, with a patchwork with various different exceptions to the patchwork as well. I mean, in my hometown of Baltimore, they prohibited facial recognition for a year. It was just a year and that has expired. But it wasn't just you need consent and the granular consent. They just said you can't do it except for some very narrow purposes for a while. So you could end up, because various jurisdictions, whether local, state, could end up regulating biometrics or some of the other information in various ways with different carve-outs. One of the important things to look at in the automotive space in particular, since many automotive OEMs and distributors have a finance arm because they provide car loans, they're covered by Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And so financial institutions subject to Gramm-Leach-Bliley can be exempt from certain requirements under certain state privacy laws. Sometimes that even extends to their affiliates. So you may find that if you're vehicle manufacturer and you're worrying about biometric information, if it happens to be that that entity has an affiliate that's a financial institution, that may create some room to operate where you're exempted from these laws to some extent, maybe fully or maybe just partially, depending on whether it's being used in certain ways.
So Jay, one last question for you is, I think in the article, you mentioned that biometric information is creating unique cybersecurity related risks, or maybe to put a finer point on it, unique cybersecurity litigation risks. Why is that?
Well, what we've seen across other industries is that cyber criminals have an understanding that the more sensitive the data is, it typically ends up being more valuable to them, both in terms of understanding the litigation risk of them obtaining that data and the leverage they may have to try to obtain a ransom or something of the likes. And so biometric data, as we've discussed throughout today, is quite sensitive. And in fact, it goes beyond just the passwords or other things that could be changed. It's something innate to us that you can't change once a cyber criminal has accessed. And for that reason, it may present as a valuable target to those who wish to profit from the collection of that data. Additionally, there's another kind of trend in the automotive industry that presents a cyber risk challenge, which is the increased use of over-the-air updates in cars. Many cars coming out, and increasingly so in the future, are equipped with being able to update software remotely, directly to the car. And I think that also, we've seen experts theorize that potentially presents a risk of cyber-related crime as well, just expanding that network and availability. So I believe with the biometrics piece being a valuable piece of information and an increased reliance in the automotive industry on data and networks, it presents a potential opportunity that companies should be aware of in terms of thinking proactively about their cybersecurity.
And Alicia, I know you litigate a lot of data breach class actions. Have you seen that biometric data, whether that is one of the compromised data fields, does that have an impact on how that litigation is ultimately settled or come to a final resolution?
You read my mind. So we have not seen a lot of data breach litigation involving biometrics yet, and I think it'll be interesting to see where that lands. So it is certainly more sensitive in the sense that you can't change it very easily. So short of having facial reconstructive surgery, this is more or less what my face looks like, and that's not going to change the way I could change my email address or phone number or password. But it's different than some of the other information that at least we see over and over in data breach litigation, plaintiffs putting forward as what they have dubbed more sensitive. So maybe that's health information or financial information or a social security number, where you can use that information to then try to take out a credit line or a loan or create health fraud. And so here in this biometric space, it's interesting that we have these identifiers that are harder to change, but can't actually be used as easily by anyone who purchases that on the dark web to figure out, well, what's the next step for them? So you can't just purchase my facial scan and then get into my vehicle. You'd have to take other steps to try to then create a way for you to look like me to get into my vehicle. So I don't know where that will lead in terms of the liability. I think it's somewhere in the middle, probably, of what we've seen with certain types of more or less sensitive information.
Okay, so James, maybe my last question is for you. Over the course of this conversation, I've concluded that state legislators are very interested in biometric data. And it sounds like cyber criminals, to Jay's point, are also interested in gaining access to that data. And Alicia, I think, is saying that plaintiffs' law firms are also interested in companies who've had that data compromised. what, if anything, is happening at the federal level in the United States?
So we are hopefully, we've been hoping for a while that there could be federal legislation that could resolve some of these, patchwork quilt issues at the state level. However, that doesn't seem like it's going anywhere very quickly, but you never know. There could be some movement that would get there. And certainly a federal comprehensive privacy bill hopefully would address biometrics to some degree with some preemption. We would see how that would play out. The core area that we're seeing biometrics show up, though, is in the absence of federal action, federal legislative action. We're seeing the Federal Trade Commission using its authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act to enforce against deceptive or unfair practices that impacting trade. They're looking at biometrics, and particularly what they're concerned about is biometrics are a sensitive type of information, as we've discussed. So the compromise of them, that could lead to certain harms to people because now people could be spoofing them. But there are other harms or alleged harms that they're looking at, that they're concerned about. So they've released a policy statement recently saying, we are now actively looking at biometrics and we are concerned about facial recognition or other forms of biometrics for their potential harms to individuals. Those could range from, again, security, as we just mentioned. It could be the fact that I may be able to recognize you in various places. So let's say we've got digital billboards with cameras, or we just have surveillance cameras that are sitting around, and they are now equipped with facial recognition. So now I'm going to recognize various people. So you could now say, oh, James Denville was at this place at this time. Maybe that place is going to reveal my religious interests. Maybe it's going to release what kind of sensitive health condition I have, because maybe I go to a medical facility which is only treating a certain kind of issue. And if that data, depending on how it's used, if I've got a camera that's just facilitating access to a certain building and it's not being shared more broadly in an ecosystem, perhaps the privacy harms there, or the alleged privacy harms, are fairly low. However, one could see that if there are certain organizations that are maybe harvesting video data from all over, and then they're maybe selling that to data brokers who could potentially then be using that for targeting advertising, determining eligibility for insurance, determining eligibility for employment and the like, just creating deep profiles of people based on now our movements and behaviors that we've tied to people through facial recognition or some biometrics. That's the type of harm that the FTC is looking at. Again, they don't have specific examples where they're saying companies are doing this. However, they want to look at this space and investigate, are companies really assessing the potential harms that could occur with biometrics? And perhaps the last one, which has been core, I think, for the federal government, the FTC lately, is as we are getting these new innovative technologies driven by AI, is looking at potential discriminatory or bias. So if you've got facial recognition that's maybe facilitating access to a certain platform that enables you to get a benefit, let's say a government benefit, we want to make sure that that's operating in a fair way so that it's not that certain people, based on skin tone or gender or head coverings, whatever it is about them, that they are provided equal access to that platform as anyone else, so that it doesn't have unintended discrimination or bias built into it.
Well, that does sound like a very ambitious objective for the FTC to get their arms around that. I really appreciate each of you joining this conversation. And I think the things that I've learned is, it sounds like biometrics is going to increasingly be part of our day-to-day experience, whether that be kind of your general consumer electronics product or whether it's in your vehicle. But I think each of you have really painted the picture that the processing of that data is not ordinary and is not something that can be treated like all the rest of the data. In fact, it's quite complicated depending on where you're doing it and the types of laws that are popping up. And it is a natural area where really basically going from criminals to legislators to regulators, all of them are very interested in that type of data. Thus, it really requires that another level of protection. So thank you very much for sharing your insights on today's call. And until the next time, thanks everybody for joining us.